For years, the Romans' power has been gradually expanding in Gaul. For years, they've seen uprising after uprising as this tribe or that revolts, or perhaps bands together with a couple of neighbors. All have been put down, some easily, some with difficulty, but all definitively. Right? Never, though, thankfully, have the Romans had to face all of Gaul. Divide and conquer, play them off each other, make native friends, help them against native enemies. Caesar was a master of executing the Romans' time-tested imperial strategy. Oddly, though, as the Romans' control over Gaul has been increasing, so has the rate of revolts seemed to increase. First the Nervii, then Dumnorix, then Indutiomarus and the Treachery, Ambiorix and the Eburones, lately the Senones and the Carnutes. All of these regional flare-ups have of course been put down or chased away in their turn. Yet, with activity increasing like this, I think it's understandable how a regular Roman in Gaul might idly wonder, what if that worst nightmare of everyone, from the rank and file up to the high command, one day were to come true? What if all Gaul, just hypothetically, were to rise up in revolt against Caesar's legions? How would the Romans fare? Was it even possible that one day they would witness the big one? I'm Alex Petkus, and this is The Cost of Glory, where it is our mission to retell the lives and deeds of the greatest Greek and Roman heroes, the men of Plutarch's lives. This is part 7 of 8 of our series on highlights from On the Gallic War, De Bello Gallico, a text written by one of the greatest Plutarch heroes of all, Julius Caesar. Book 7 is the climax of De Bello Gallico. It's also the last book of this particular work that Caesar wrote himself. We have Book 8, the final book of the work, that tells the story of the campaign years of 51 and 50. Book 8, though, was written by Caesar's friend, Aulus Hirtius, the consul of 43 BC. But this is still worth reading, and we'll get to it next time. Now then, we haven't heard anything of any great revolt at the very beginning of Book 7. We haven't heard of the great Vercingetorix yet. But already from the first sentences in this book, Caesar is setting the scene, implicitly answering, why did what was about to happen now? Quote, when Gaul was finally quiet, Caesar set out for Italy. By Italy, he means here the assigned province that he has of Cisalpine Gaul, as he had determined to hold the assizes. Going on here, there Caesar heard of the murder of Clodius, and having been informed of the Senate's decree that all younger men of military age in Italy should be sworn in, he decided to hold a levy throughout his own province. These events were speedily reported to Transalpine Gaul. End quote. So the details of what's going on here in Rome we've covered already in the life of Pompey, part 3, but this is relevant. So one mobster aristocrat, Clodius, he got murdered out on the highway by another mobster, Milo, and then Clodius's followers basically accused the Roman establishment of putting a hit out on Clodius. And so in retaliation, they burn his body on a funeral pyre in the Senate house. And this burns the whole building down, and rioting and lawlessness ensue throughout the city. This is a huge social upheaval, and so Pompey is the man on the scene. He really has to come in and crack down with his soldiers to reestablish order. There's mass panic, and this includes a senatorial decree that a levy of soldiers should be held throughout Italy, and that essentially is about only internal security. So these are bad signs for the Republic. But Caesar's saying that he's doing his part here. He's raising some troops in his own province for the sake of the Republic. So that's what that's all about. And these reports about Roman turmoil, he says, they reach Transalpine Gaul. He means, of course, that they reach the Gauls themselves. Civil disturbances and anarchy in Rome, eh? Caesar preoccupied, eh? And he tells us, here's the conversation that the Gauls are having as soon as they hear about this. Quote, the Gauls added to the reports a circumstance of their own invention, which the occasion seemed to require, that Caesar was detained by the commotion at Rome, and in view of discord so serious, could not come to the army. Now, this is a reasonable inference, but remember, Caesar didn't say that he was detained by these disturbances, just that he heard about it, and he took action. Going on here. Such an opportunity served as a stimulus to those who even before were chafing at their subjection to the sovereignty of Rome, and they began with greater freedom and audacity to make plans for a campaign of rebellion. The chiefs of Gaul summoned conventions by mutual arrangement in remote spots and complained of the death of Acco. And I neglected to mention this from the last episode. Acco was the arch-conspirator of a rebellion among the Senones and the Carnutes, who are in central Gaul, and Caesar said in Book 6 that he exacted punishment in our traditional fashion, that is, the fashion reserved for traitors in particular, and this means, it's a little gruesome, prepare yourself, so they tie the guy to a stake, they flog him with a whip until he is dead or unconscious, and then they behead him. And Goldsworthy notes here, the head had a great importance in Gallic religion. So, this is a particularly disturbing way to go for the Gauls. And here's what the Gauls are saying. And I think it's interesting how Caesar realizes how seriously that they took this execution of this guy Acco. Quote, they pointed out that his fate, that Acco's fate, might fall next upon themselves. They expressed pity for the common lot of Gaul. By all manner of promises and rewards, they called for men to start the campaign of rebellion, and at the risk of their own life to champion the liberty of Gaul. Continuing on, first and foremost, they said, they must devise means before ever the secret designs got abroad to shut Caesar off from the army. It was an easy task because the legions would not dare to march out of their forts in the absence of the commander-in-chief, nor could he, without a strong escort, reach the legions. Finally, it was better, they urged, to be slain in battle than to fail of recovering their old renown in war and the liberty which they had received from their forefathers. End quote. So that's really all that Caesar says as far as the why now question. The Gauls want liberty, they always have, and now Caesar's away. He's detained, so they think, and there's chaos in Rome detaining him. And yet, something seems to have shifted. And it's worth dwelling on this for a little bit. So here's what Napoleon says in his description of how the revolt began. Quote, the Romans no longer concealed their ambition of reducing Gaul to a province. In every town they had a faction, which they sought by every means to render dominant. The Gauls shuddered to behold the dangers which threatened their liberty. End quote. So, something has shifted. According to Napoleon, the Romans no longer concealed their ambition of reducing Gaul to a province. And, they're keeping a faction in every city of a pro-Roman faction that they're supporting. And the Gauls see this as an intrusion on their sovereignty. Goldsworthy, in his biography of Caesar, Colossus, has a good explanation too, and I'll summarize it here. So for a while, at least, the Gallic chieftains were using Caesar as much as he was using them. They're using Roman alliance as a lever to win at the games that they're used to playing already, which is warring amongst themselves and striving to obtain supremacy in their own tribes. But if the Romans become permanent arbiters of any dispute, rather than the occasional big brother ally, and the Gauls are, now going to be reprimanded simply for doing their thing, raiding and stealing women and cows, beheading their neighbors now and then. Or if a self-respecting chieftain isn't allowed to seize the occasional throne in his own country, of all places. This is their way of life. Recall Caesar forcing the Aedui to give their arms up back in Book 2, how reluctant they were. What are they supposed to do? And Caesar himself has already pointed out in his ethnographic digression in Book 6 that we saw last time that the single form of influence and power known among the Gauls, is how many servants and dependents you have about you, namely how many fighting men you can call up to avenge a wrong or settle a feud or, conduct a raid. It all depends, their entire power structure depends on them having the freedom to use violence, more or less as they please amongst themselves, without reference to some higher power staring at them from across the Alps. Caesar surely understood that the ultimate plan that he had in mind, and of course he had it in mind, right? That, Roman domination was eventually going to be intolerable to those people. It was only a matter of time. Yet apparently he wasn't expecting it when it happened. Now first take a sec to let me tell you something about the people who made this series possible. One of the things you see, especially in Caesar's middle years, was that he was fanatical both about surrounding himself with the best talent and using the power of experts to take maximum advantage of emerging opportunities. You see this in his Gallic war campaigns with local Gallic intermediaries, with local expertise and networks, with his engineering team who built bridges, ships, siege works for him, and his political network always operating on overdrive at Rome in his absence. So there's a lesson there. If you want to find a way to integrate new, cutting-edge, AI-powered solutions for your business processes or develop new business models with them, whether you're a small or medium-sized business or even enterprise scale, this is a very complex problem that needs to be tailored to your exact market and situation. And maybe you shouldn't be doing this all alone. That's where our sponsor comes in, the AI Lab, powered by Shockworks. I'm friends with the founder, Alejandro. He's a huge fan of the Cost of Glory, and I've met many members of their amazing team. The AI Lab specializes in deploying tailored agentic AI models, and they take a consultative approach to fit your precise needs. Besides having a deep global portfolio of projects, developing custom software for businesses of all kinds, the AI Lab has boots-on-the-ground presence in labs across many great cities in the U.S. and the world. Their flagship office, though, their Rome, as it were, maybe their Cisalpine Gaul, is in Austin, Texas. And one of the best things for their customers is that the AI Lab has a business model in which they only win if you win. They only make money if they either save you money or add to your revenue. So if you want to conquer your city or your market, or say, take on the establishment like Caesar did, then partner with the best. And even if you're just curious about how AI can help out your company, reach out to them at austinlab.ai. Or if you're in Austin sometime, you can just stop by and meet the team in person. Thanks, AI Lab, for being fans of the Cost of Glory. Well, here's how it all started. We're in the same council, by the way, that he was reporting on earlier, sort of fictionalized council of their discussions amongst themselves. Quote, when these subjects had been discussed, the Carnutes declared that there was no hazard they refused for the general welfare, and they promised that they would be the first of all to make war. End quote. And so it's the Carnutes now, the men of Chartres, as Napoleon calls them, who take the lead. Remember, the Carnutes are the ones in whose territory the great Druid gatherings occur, as we discussed in part 6 last time. So, they have some kind of religious primacy maybe among the Gauls. And here's what the Carnutes do. Quote, when the day came, the Carnutes, under the leadership of 2 desperate men, Catuatus and Concanetadumnus, rushed at a given signal on Cenabum, the town of Cenabum, and put to the sword the Roman citizens who had established themselves there for trading purposes. End quote. So they, attack this town. Caesar gives the name of one of these guys that they murdered, Gaius Fufius Quita. It's a way to drive in the pathos of the whole affair. But, I think we have to imagine that this was a large-scale, relatively speaking, large-scale bloody slaughter of at least dozens, maybe hundreds of people, probably including women and children, Roman businessmen, maybe retired veterans who brought their families to, do some trading in Gaul. Cenabum, by the way, is modern Orléans, which is maybe 2 hours' drive south of Paris now. So notice now, these Gauls leading the revolt are more in central France. These Carnutes haven't come up much over the course of the last 6 books. There was a minor revolt Caesar discussed briefly in the last book that was put down very quickly, and Acco, their leader, executed, as we've just mentioned. Most of the other revolts and battles, though, have been close to the fringes. Belgium, Helvetica, Germany, Britain, these sort of wilder, warlike peoples. But this is disturbingly close to the heartland, close to the good old, loyal Aedui. Well, here's the result of this massacre at Cenabum. Quote, "Speedily the report thereof was carried to all the states of Gaul. As a matter of fact, whenever any event of greater note or importance occurs, the Gauls shout it abroad through the fields and districts, and then others take it up in turn and pass it on to their next neighbors, as happened on this occasion. For deeds done at Cenabum at sunrise were heard of before the end of the first watch of the night in the borders of the Arverni, a distance of about 160 miles. That's about 150 modern miles that this report travels over the course of a single day, Caesar says. To the Arverni, the men of Auvergne, which takes its name from this powerful tribe, and these guys live in Auvergne, which is a historical region of central, sort of southern central France. It's, again, 150 miles due south of the Carnutes, and that puts the Arverni's territory rather close to the Roman province proper of Transalpine Gaul. And who does it reach among the Arverni but our hero, anti-hero, Vercingetorix? Here's where we first meet him. Quote, "There Vercingetorix, son of Celtillus, an Arvernian youth of supreme influence, acted in a similar way. Details in a moment. His father had held the chieftainship of all Gaul, and consequently, because he aimed at the kingship, his dad, he had been put to death by his own state." Now, Vercingetorix, as his name implies, the rix ending sort of signifies something like rex in Latin, king. It's a royal sort of family name, kind of like Dumnorix, like Ambiorix. And Cassius Dio notes that Vercingetorix and Caesar knew each other before this. It's likely that Vercingetorix had served as a leader among Caesar's auxiliary cavalry units. The Arverni are a much more civilized Roman familiar tribe. They're like the Aedui or the Sequani. They're not like those wild Belgae. Vercingetorix in particular is, I think we have to imagine, a man intimately familiar with Roman ways. Well, here's what he does. Quote, "Vercingetorix summoned his own dependents and easily fired their spirit. As soon as his designs were known, there was a general rush to arms. Gobonitio, his uncle, and the rest of the chiefs, who did not think this adventure should be hazarded, sought to prevent him. Vercingetorix was cast out of the town of Gergovia, but he did not give up for all of that, and in the fields he held a levy of beggars and outcasts." And Caesar, he likes to emphasize how desperate and hopeless are the men who would dare to sign up for this, unjust revolt against Rome. But I think considering the scale and the success of this endeavor that we're about to see, Caesar's probably not to be trusted on this particular point. Well, going on here, quote, "Then having got together a body of this sort, he brought over to his own way of thinking all the members of his state whom he approached, urging them to take up arms for the sake of general liberty." Maybe he's just started with these, rowdy characters, and now he's getting legitimacy. It's going on here. "And after having collected large forces, he cast out of the state his opponents, by whom he had been expelled a short time before, and he was greeted as king by his followers. He sent out deputations in every direction, adjuring the tribesmen to remain loyal to him. And listen to this. He speedily added to his side the Senones, the Parisii, the Pictones, the Cadurci, the Turoni, Aulurci, Lemovices, Andi, and all the other maritime tribes. By consent of all, the command was bestowed upon him. And, he gets hostages from them. He tells them how many soldiers and horses and how much grain and arms to supply, etc. But now Caesar's going to give us a little taste of his leadership style. Quote, "To the utmost care, he added the utmost strictness of command, compelling waverers by severity of punishment. Indeed, for the commission of a greater offense, he put men to death with fire and all manners of torture. For a lesser case, he sent a man home with his ears cut off or one eye gouged out, to point the moral to the rest and terrify the others by the severity of the penalty." End quote. So Vercingetorix means business here, and he quickly gets together a large army. He immediately takes to the field against a tribe called the Bituriges, who have been hesitating to join his rebellion. See, the Bituriges are between the Carnutes and the Arverni, and they call to the Aedui for help, Roman allies, the Aedui, of course, but also the Aedui are the Bituriges' tribal patrons. The Bituriges are like subordinate to the Aedui. And so the Aedui, for their part, reach out to notify, as one should, as a good Aedui, the Roman legates. And amazingly, these are the guys that are, in Gaul, they're in winter quarters. Amazingly, tellingly, I think, the Roman legates say, hey, they're your clients, you guys got this. And so they advise the Aedui and go and take care of it on their own, go help their subordinates out. The Romans will just sit tight in their forts. So they're clearly not taking this seriously. But then again, it's still the dead of winter. It's maybe February at this point. So the Aedui ride up to the Loire River, which separates their territory from the Bituriges, and then they hang out there for a few days, sizing up the situation. But then they decide to ride back home, and they claim that they were worried that the Bituriges would betray them. They got a funny feeling about these Bituriges guys. And Caesar says here he never actually found out if they were being honest or not, but it seemed to be a bad sign. And as soon as the Aedui ride off, of course, the Bituriges capitulate, and they join Vercingetorix's rebellion. Now, at last, Caesar hears about all of this, and he realizes something has gone very wrong. Quote, "When these matters were reported to Caesar in Italy, he had already received intelligence that affairs in Rome had been brought by the brave actions of Gnaeus Pompeius into a more satisfactory state." So yes, Caesar's good friend Pompey is taking care of business at Rome. This will refer, by the way, to Pompey's unprecedented sole consulship for that year. See his Cost of Glory biography that we did, part 3 for that. But this allows Caesar to snap into action. Going on here, quote, "Caesar therefore set out for Transalpine Gaul. Upon arrival there, he was confronted with great difficulty as to the means whereby he should reach the army. For if he should summon the legions to the province," he means the legions that are in the forts out there in Gallic tribal lands. He's talking about calling them to southwest Gaul, to the Roman province proper. If he did that, he realized that on the march, they might have to fight an action without his presence. If, on the other hand, he himself pressed on to the army, he saw that it was a mistake to entrust his personal safety at that time, even to the tribes which appeared to be at peace. So he's not even going to trust the tribes that he would have to go through. So it's dangerous to join the legions. It's dangerous also to summon them to where he is in the province. What to do? Well, Caesar picks the path of most aggression. And here's what I mean. So he follows the border of the Roman province west, goes kind of along the coast, the Mediterranean coast, and he gets to the foothills of the Cévennes mountain range. This is south-central France. This is a kind of natural barrier between the Roman province and the Arvernes territory. And on this range, the Cévennes, Caesar says, quote, "Now the range of the Cévennes, in this, the severest season of the year, was likely to hinder the march with great depth of snow. However, he cleared away snow 6 feet deep, and having thus opened up the roads by a supreme effort of the troops, reached the borders of the Arverni. They were caught off their guard, for they thought themselves fortified by the VII as by a wall, and not even a solitary traveler had ever found the paths open at that season of the year. And Caesar then commanded the cavalry to extend on as broad a front as possible so as to strike terror into the enemy." End quote. Now, he doesn't specify exactly how many troops and cavalry he's scraped together. He did a little bit of a levy in the province, got some cohorts together. It's not a whole lot, but it's enough to make an impression. And that was precisely the point. So, he immediately orders his men to start ravaging the territory of the Arverni over this large swath. And then more or less as soon as he arrives, he leaves. He's betting that Vercingetorix is going to get pressured by his countrymen to respond to this. They're burning the farms of the Arverni, and so that would force Vercingetorix to abandon his campaign against the Bituriges and march south. And Caesar bets correctly. This is exactly what happens. And so, meanwhile, before he knows whether his plan has worked, he tells his men who are there ravaging the territory of the Arverni, he says, "I'll be back in 3 days." And he's not planning to be back in 3 days, but he wants that message to leak to Vercingetorix, for Vercingetorix to believe that Caesar's in the area and going to stay in the area. Meanwhile, he personally, with, I think we have to imagine, a very modest bodyguard of probably mounted men, he blitzes northeast some 200 miles, lightning fast, to where he's got 2 legions wintering, and he takes command of them, and he musters up several other nearby legions before the Arverni even know what's going on. And this move, this feint and then dash, the whole first part of this campaign, really, you see Caesar's incredible thunderbolt speed on full display. But now here's what Caesar's up against. Vercingetorix finally figures this out eventually, and he turns around and he attacks a fort of the Boii, who are nearby-ish. They're Roman allies. And here's what happens. Quote, "This action of Vercingetorix caused Caesar great difficulty in forming his plan of campaign. If he were to keep the legions in one place for the rest of the winter, he was afraid that the reduction of the tributaries of the Aedui, that is the Bituriges and now maybe the Boii, would be followed by a revolt of all Gaul, on the ground that Caesar was found to be no safeguard to his friends. If he were to bring the legions out of their forts too soon, though, he was afraid that the difficulties of transport would cause trouble with the grain supply. Because it's winter, there's just not a lot of grain to be found. So, his question that he's wondering is, stay in camp and avoid the risk of starving and running out of supplies, or go save his allies. So what do you think he's going to do? Quote, "However, it seemed preferable to endure any and every difficulty, rather than to put up with so dire a disgrace, and thus to alienate the sympathies of all his own adherents." End quote. Of course. So Caesar here, his strategy is he's doing everything he possibly can to stop a domino effect, because that would be the worst thing. And I'll summarize what happens next here. So Caesar sends word to the Boii, "Hang on tight, guys, I'll be there soon. Don't capitulate." And then meanwhile, in very quick succession, I won't go into the details, but he captures several fortresses in the territory of the Senones and the Carnutes. It takes him 2 days each. He actually starts sieging the second place before the first has even been captured. But he does capture that one too, his legates do. And so these places include Cenabum, by the way. That was the place where the revolt started, at Orleans. Cenabum he sacks and completely burns to the ground for their crimes. But this is happening so fast, and I love the way that Plutarch describes Caesar's speed on this campaign in particular, when so much was on the line. Quote, "For where it would have been hard to believe if one of his messengers or letter carriers could make his way within a long time span, There Caesar was seen with his whole army, at once ravaging their lands and destroying their strongholds, subduing cities, on and on. And so what do you know once he gets to the territory of the Bituriges, who again, they've now defected from the Aedui, joined the revolt. His plan works, because Vercingetorix, as soon as Caesar's around, he abandons his attack on the Boii and he goes to meet Caesar. Caesar, meanwhile, captures yet another town, Noviodunum, and then he makes his way for Avaricum. Now, the affair of Avaricum is a kind of early encounter in the year's campaign, but it's the first clash of Caesar and Vercingetorix, and it reveals in fascinating detail the character of Vercingetorix. Also, it's one of Caesar's most extensive descriptions of an assault on a Gallic stronghold, so it's worth looking at how he handles it here. Avaricum, by the way, is modern Bourges. It's in the territory of the Bituriges, who are, you guessed it, the men of Bourges from Bituriges. It's pretty cool. So we're smack in the center of what's now modern France. And this is their most fortified town, the Bituriges. It's their most fertile territory. So if Caesar can take this, he figures he might just bring the Bituriges back over to his side. So the armies are approaching each other, and as Vercingetorix is closing in on Caesar, he pauses and he addresses the Gauls in an assembly. And listen to this, because I think for the first time here, we really get into the mind of Vercingetorix. I think by far the most interesting character besides Caesar in this whole work. Vercingetorix offers some fascinating insights here on how the Romans do war and their weaknesses. Quote, having experienced 3 continuous reverses at Willauodunum, Cenabum, and Noviodunum, Vercingetorix summoned his followers to a convention. He pointed out that this campaign must now be conducted in far different fashion from previously. What does he mean by that? Well, going on, by every possible means, they, the Gauls, must endeavor to prevent the Romans from obtaining forage and supplies. The task was easy, because the Gauls had an abundance of horsemen and were assisted by the season of the year. He means, by the way, it's around May, again 52 BC, and by May, the harvest isn't in yet. It's not till later in the summer. So he explains, the forage could not be cut. Pabulum is the word there in Latin, and that is pack animal fodder. The enemy must of necessity scatter to seek it from the farm buildings, and all these detachments could be picked off daily by the horsemen. So that's his plan. Try not to give battle, but to just deprive the Romans of supplies. But then now imagine having to ask an entire nation's worth of fighting men to do the following here. Quote, moreover, for the sake of the common good, the interests of private property must be disregarded. Hamlets and homesteads must be burnt in every direction, for such a distance from the route as the enemy seemed likely to penetrate in quest of forage. The Gauls had a supply of such necessaries because they were assisted by the resources of the tribes in whose territory the campaign was being carried on. The Romans would not endure scarcity, or else would advance farther from their camp at great risk. End quote. And then listen to this. This man thinks like a great classical commander. Continuing on, quote, and it made no difference whether the Gauls killed the Romans or merely stripped them of their pack animals, the loss of which rendered the campaign impossible. Pack animals. So he means horses, yes, but also donkeys and mules who will be carting around the army's battle gear and tents and pots and pans and sword sharpening kits. I imagine maybe oxen are important here. But Vercingetorix knows that all these pack animals are like the wheels of the Roman war juggernaut. So he's going to just try to strip them of those. He's clearly very intimate with the way that the Romans do war, again, probably because he fought alongside them extensively. And he's not done making his ask here. Quote, Moreover, any towns, so not just farmsteads and villages, but any towns proper, which were not secure from all danger by fortification or natural position, ought to be burnt, in order that they might not afford the Gauls a refuge for the avoidance of service, nor offer the Romans a chance to carry off plunder and store of supplies. If these measures seemed grievous or cruel, they ought to take account that it was far more grievous that their children and their wives should be dragged off into slavery, and that they themselves should be slaughtered, the inevitable fate of the conquered." End quote. Well, Vercingetorix gets them to agree. And then, in a single day, the rebels set more than 20 cities of the Bituriges on fire. That's the territory that they're in. And they also send out riders to do this in other states as well. And Caesar, who by this time is pretty much right there nearby, he comments that conflagrations could be seen in every direction. Imagine the smell of smoke all around, the browning sky, watering eyes, the apocalyptic sight of it all. Imagine how that would steel you for war. Vercingetorix really was a master of psychology, and we're going to see more of this shortly. However, the Bituriges, seeing their entire world go up in flames, they're looking at Avaricum, and they're getting second thoughts. Quote, "In the common council, they especially deliberated over Avaricum, whether to burn or defend it. The Bituriges flung themselves at the feet of all the Gauls, entreating that they might not be compelled with their own hands to set light to almost the fairest city in all of Gaul, the safeguard and ornament of their state. They declared that they would easily defend themselves by its natural strength, for it was surrounded by a river and a marsh on almost every side, and had a continual and very narrow approach. Vercingetorix at first argued against it, but after hearing continual prayers by the tribesmen and compassion from the multitude, he finally gave in to the Bituriges. Suitable defenders for the town were chosen." End quote. So they're not going to burn Avaricum, but defend it. Fateful choice. Now then, the Gauls send defenders into the city just before Caesar and the Romans get there, and Caesar gets busy laying siege to Avaricum/Bourges. And as he's doing this, Vercingetorix is, as expected, he's making life hell for the Romans as they're foraging. They have abundance of cavalry. Caesar deprived of a lot of his cavalry, who normally would be, the allied Gallic cavalry, but, they're fighting for the enemy now. And the Romans, meanwhile, they're doing everything they can as they're going out on these foraging expeditions to make themselves hard to catch. They're trying to vary the times and their routes for getting to where they're going to go foraging, but they just keep getting caught and taking losses. I mean, the country is just crawling with Gallic enemy horsemen. The Romans are getting very hungry. Those animals are getting very hungry. And in a way, the besieger has kind of become the besieged. This is a foretaste of what comes later in the year. But Caesar manages to start building a siege ramp. He can't encircle the city with a siege wall properly because it's swampy and there's a river on most of the sides. So he's just building a ramp to roll towers up. And meanwhile, he keeps dunning the Aedui and the Boii for supplies. Where's the goods, gentlemen? But the Boii, they're puny and they're poor and they don't really have anything to spare. But the Aedui are proving strangely incompetent and not coming through. Well, in the midst of the hunger and deprivation, Caesar takes his own turn at flipping the psychological situation. Quote, "It got so bad that for several days the troops were entirely without grain and staved off the actual starvation by driving in cattle from the more distant hamlets." So they're going full carnivore diet, but it's, really meager amounts of meat, I think we have to imagine here, and there's sort of nothing to, accompany it with. "Yet never a word was heard from their lips unworthy of the dignity of Rome and of their previous victories. Nay more, when Caesar addressed single legions at work, here he goes, and declared that if the burden of scarcity were too bitter for them to bear, he would end the siege. All the soldiers begged him not to do so. They had served, they said, for many years under his command without once incurring disgrace, without anywhere leaving a task unaccomplished. They would regard it as a supreme disgrace if they relinquished the siege they had begun. It would be better to endure any and every bitterness than to fail of avenging the Roman citizens who had perished at Cenabum by the treachery of the Gauls. They entrusted messages in the same spirit to the centurions and the tribunes to be tendered to Caesar through them. End quote. So, these guys are saying, we want revenge, Caesar. No, let's do it. And they've already burnt Cenabum to the ground, of course. And they, captured all of its citizens, and I imagine that those will be headed for the slave markets. But I guess they didn't feel like they had apprehended the real perpetrators, maybe, who were going to include the Gallic rebels, some of whom are currently defending Avaricum. So that's going on. So the siege preparations, they're going okay. But Caesar then hears that Vercingetorix has moved his camp up, and an interesting little engagement ensues. Here's what happens. Like I said, Caesar hears Vercingetorix's camp nearby. However, Vercingetorix happens, this particular morning, to have gone out with the cavalry to set some ambush for the Romans. And so Caesar sneaks 2 legions up. He leaves the rest of the guys at the siege. And these 2 armies basically form up for battle. The Gauls and the Romans, they get really close to each other. The Gauls are on a hill, and there's a swamp around the hill. They're in a very superior position. And Caesar decides, we could probably take them, but we'd face heavy losses. And so he ends up just marching away. The soldiers are very disappointed, a fact which reflects well on them, Caesar notes. They wanted to go into battle and good, but he explains to them, it's the commander's job not just to win at all costs, but to make sure that he only takes risks worth taking. And Caesar, he really wants to emphasize that even though he is personally bold and even daring with his own life, he really does aim not to be reckless with the lives of his men. But so after this non-battle, then Vercingetorix gets back because he was away. And, the Gauls didn't charge down the hill, presumably because they had no commander, because he's catching some heat for basically leaving nobody in charge. And the Gauls were frustrated and they were scared. And so here's how Vercingetorix handles this situation. I think it's fascinating. Quote, when Vercingetorix returned to his followers, he was accused of treachery. 1, because he had moved the camp nearer to the Romans. 2, because he had gone off with all the horse and had left so large a force without a commander. And 3, because he had offered the Romans such a great opportunity for attacking them as soon as he was gone. All these circumstances, they said, could not have happened by chance or without design. He preferred, they're alleging, to possess the kingship of Gaul by the leave of Caesar, rather than by the favor of themselves. End quote. Remember, we mentioned that he knows Caesar somehow, most likely high-ranking auxiliary cavalry officer fighting with the Romans at some points. They're saying, you've got some trick up your sleeve. This is some 4D chess with Caesar. We don't trust you. You can imagine maybe this, these rumors are getting spread by people who want to take the command for themselves. Who knows? Well, here's how Vercingetorix responds. Quote, accused in such sort, he replied to the charges. 1, as for having moved the camp, it had been done, he said, actually at their own insistence, because they were short of forage. As for having gone nearer the Romans, he had been motivated by the suitability of the new camp's location, where they could more easily protect themselves by the location's natural defenses. He means the hill that they were on, surrounded by a swamp. Pretty good point. Furthermore, 2, it was on purpose that he had committed the chief command to no one at his departure, for fear that whoever he left in command might be driven by the collective enthusiasm of the troops to an engagement. Indeed, he saw that all were zealous for a quick, decisive engagement through weakness of spirit, because they could not longer endure hardship. So in other words, Vercingetorix is perceiving one of the key advantages that the Romans have in these wars. The Gauls love to rush into battle, but it's easy to rush into battle. You get dopamine, you get adrenaline, you don't have to think or wait or agonize. The hard part is enduring the long toils, the deprivation, the monotony, the weeks and months of fear and uncertainty. Fascinating psychological insight here by Vercingetorix, or Caesar. I think you could probably abstract that to building a company, which is a lot more like a long war than just a quick battle. Okay, going on to point 3. This accusation that he was somehow in cahoots with Caesar, right? 3, if the appearance of the Romans on the scene had been due to chance, the Gauls had fortune to thank. But if they had been summoned thither by some informer, the Gauls had that man to thank for the satisfaction of having been able to learn from their higher vantage point the scantiness of the enemy's numbers. And so, he's mentioning here, the Romans, there's not that many of them. Well, Caesar only took 2 legions out, right? He's got a bunch more, for the record. But Vercingetorix is a master persuader here, going on here. And, they have that guy to thank for the fact that they are now able to despise a so-called courage, which had not even ventured to fight, but had retired disgracefully to camp. He had no need to obtain from Caesar by treachery a title of command which he could enjoy by a victory which was already assured for himself and all the Gauls. Nay more, he would give up his present command if they thought that they were bestowing honor on him, rather than themselves deriving security from him. End quote. Now then, watch what he does here. That you may perceive, Vercingetorix continued, the sincerity of this statement on my part, listen to these Roman soldiers. He brought forward slaves, whom he had caught foraging a few days before and had tortured with hunger and chains. These had been previously coached on what to state when questioned, and thus they said that they were legionnaires. They're not, right? They're just slaves, probably scrawny-looking ones for added effect. They had been induced by hunger and want to go secretly out of the camp to see if they could find any corn or cattle in the fields. The whole army was suffering from similar want. No man had any strength left. None could endure the strain of work. And therefore the commander-in-chief had decided, Caesar that is, if they made no progress in the siege of the town in 3 days to withdraw the army. These, said Vercingetorix, are the benefits you have received from me whom you accuse of treachery, by whose effort, without the shedding of your blood, you behold this great victorious army wasted with hunger, while it is I who have seen to it that when it takes shelter in disgraceful flight, no state shall admit it within its borders. So these kinds of demonstrations are very characteristic of great classical generals. Hannibal liked to stage these kind of demonstrations before his own army, Sertorius too. And I think Caesar's kind of playing this aspect of Vercingetorix up. Caesar's audience will get this impression that Vercingetorix is acting like a great world stage epic military leader, a master not just of military strategy, but of psychological tactics, a master of his own men. And sure enough, quote, the whole host shouted with one accord and clashed their arms together in their peculiar fashion, as they always do for a man whose speech they approve. They declared that Vercingetorix was a consummate leader, that there could be no doubt of his loyalty, and that the campaign could not be conducted with greater intelligence. End quote. So they renew their spirits for the fight for Avaricum, and they send 10,000 more troops, and they somehow sneak them in to this city. And so the struggle to take Avaricum by storm by the Romans begins in earnest now. And here is Caesar on how that went. The matchless courage of our troops was met by all manner of contrivances on the part of the Gauls, for they are a nation possessed of remarkable ingenuity and extremely apt to copy and carry out anything suggested to them. So now they sought to drag aside the grappling hooks with nooses, and when they had caught them, to pull them back inwards with winches. And they tried to undercut the ramp by tunneling, in which they were very highly skilled because they have large iron mines in their country, and they habitually used every kind of mining technique. Further, they had furnished the whole wall on every side with a superstructure of wooden turrets, and covered these over with hides. Then they would make frequent sallies by day and night, and thereby try to set fire to the ramp or attack the troops engaged in the works. And however much we raised our ramp and turrets by day, they matched by connecting with beams and planks the long uprights of their own towers, adding stories to them. And they would break open our siege tunnels, interrupt their continuation, and keep them from reaching the walls by throwing down wooden beams with fire-hardened points and boiling pitch and boulders of massive weight." End quote. So it's all-out engineering warfare. And Caesar describes here, too, how the Gauls make these incredibly strong walls with perpendicular kind of lattices of huge 40-foot logs strapped together at intervals and then packed with stones and rubble. They're impossible to knock down with a battering ram. They're impossible to tear apart with grappling hooks. And, he notes, the masonry is not unattractive to look at. And the fighting goes on. The Romans manage finally to build a ramp, 330 feet wide, 80 feet high, and who knows how long. Caesar doesn't even say. And they start rolling towers up this ramp. And then one night the Gauls set fire to the whole thing. They tunnel under it, and they set fires from the tunnels under it, and they sally out of their gate with buckets of pitch that they're pouring on the fire. It's just incredible, the all-out contrivance of death and destruction that both sides are able to muster here. And once the rest of the Gauls in the city see the ramp on fire and the towers on fire, they get very excited, and they give it the all-out assault. And they were convinced, Caesar said, that the deliverance of all Gaul depended on what was happening at that very moment. And he gives one very striking example. And listen to this, and I don't know, pour out a little drink for the men that you're about to hear about now. I think Caesar would have. Quote, "Then there occurred before our eyes a thing which, as it seemed worthy of record, we have not thought it right to omit. A certain Gaul was standing before the town gate. Clods of tallow and pitch were passed from hand to hand to him." He's throwing it on the fire. "He was pierced by a dart from a scorpion in the right side and fell dead." A scorpion is what they call a certain mobile artillery device that looks like kind of like a heavy crossbow. It's got a long barrel, and there's a cranking wheel at the back. So it really does kind of look like a scorpion. You know, the bow coming out sort of is like the pincers. Anyway, so you can fix this device in a certain place and just leave it there, and it will just keep hitting the same target, basically, over and over again if you don't move it. And you got to think that the Gauls must realize this, right? So here's what happens going on. One of the Gauls near him, this man who's just fallen, stepped over his prostrate body and went on with the same work, throwing clods of tallow and pitch on the fire. And when this second man had been killed in the same fashion by a scorpion shot, a third succeeded, and to the third a fourth. And that spot was not left bare of defenders until the ramp had been extinguished, the enemy cleared away on every side, and a stop put to the fighting. And you've got to think it must have been a really, really good spot to throw clumps of fat and pitch on the ramp from. But wow, what dogged bravery these Gauls are showing that they've got under a commander of the caliber of Vercingetorix. I mean, he's not in the fort, but, you know, they know they're fighting for him. Well, long story short, the sally there to set the ramp on fire, I mean, they set it on fire, but, you know, they don't drive off the Romans. And so the next day, the Gallic warriors think that they're kind of out of luck. Caesar's going to rebuild the ramp. They've lost a lot of men, and they're thinking about trying to make a break for it, and their women won't allow it. You know, when the men try to leave, the women start screaming and betray the men leaving. They're like, "Don't abandon us." So at that moment, more or less, Caesar launches a surprise attack. He ends up capturing the city as many are trying to flee. And the result here is horrific. Of the 40,000 people in Avaricum, Caesar says, only 800 made it out alive. And he may have had reason to exaggerate that number a little bit, the casualties, because the Romans were, as a people, inclined to demand extreme satisfaction for the kind of treacherous mass murder of Roman citizens that the Gauls had shown at Cenabum. But apparently, as Caesar says, motivated by the thought of avenging their countrymen, and I have to imagine, too, maybe they're feeling a little crazed from the lack of food, from the intensity and violence of the siege and the constant casualties the Gauls have been inflicting on them from these raids. The Roman soldiers spare neither woman nor child nor the elderly in their sack of the city. You may have heard it said that greatness is revealed more in how someone handles defeat than in how someone handles victory. If that were ever true, Caesar thinks it's true of Vercingetorix. And I'm going to read you a quote here, but before I read this, just imagine the horror as a commander, if something like this happens on your watch. And try to feel for yourself the kind of nerve it would take to make a speech like he's about to make. And not just to say these words, but to say them with 100% conviction so that people actually believe you. Okay, quote, on the next day, summoning a conference, Vercingetorix comforted them and exhorted them not greatly to lose heart, nor to be disturbed by the disaster. The Romans had not conquered by courage nor in pitched battle, but by stratagem and by knowledge of siege operations in which the Gauls had had no experience. It was a mistake to expect in war that all events would have had a favorable issue. He himself had never agreed with the defense of Avaricum, and of that he had themselves as witnesses. This is really crucial for him to bring that point up. But this experience of disaster had been brought about by the short-sightedness of the Bituriges and the undue complacence of the rest. You remember the Bituriges begged them not to burn Avaricum, and they took pity, foolishly. However, Vercingetorix said, he would speedily remedy it by greater advantages. He would by his own efforts bring to their side the remaining states which currently stood apart from the rest of Gaul, and thereby create a single will for the whole of Gaul. And when the Gauls were united, not even the world could resist, and already he had almost brought that to pass. And he asks them, therefore, to get to work fortifying their camp properly, which they amazingly haven't done yet. And I think maybe that's part of the lesson, that in a disaster like this, you might just try to pick something very obvious and concrete that everyone can actually start doing and tell them to do it. And just that alone can really change the mood. And here's how they respond, the Gauls. This is such an important lesson for any leader facing a huge setback like this. Quote, the speech was not unpleasing to the Gauls, especially because Vercingetorix himself had not lost courage after the great disaster they had suffered, nor hidden out of their sight and avoided the gaze of the host. And they considered his foresight and forethought the greater because, while the matter was still open, he had first advocated the burning and afterwards the abandonment of Avaricum. And thus, whereas the authority of commanders in general is diminished by reverses, so his position, on the contrary, was daily enhanced by the disaster they had suffered. At the same time, they were inclined to be hopeful by reason of his assurance about bringing in the remaining states. And on this occasion, for the first time, the Gauls set to work to fortify the camp, and they were so strengthened in spirit that although unaccustomed to toil, they thought that they must submit to any commands. End quote. So, once again, the best way to overcome a failure like this is often to just throw yourself and your guys into hard work. All right. Well, Caesar gets to work following up his victory, but he's delayed by some trouble among the Aedui. There's a quarrel over two candidates for the chief magistracy of the Aedui, the military magistracy, the Vergobret office, which involves some specific local laws, and Caesar's busy trying to put down the most serious rebellion he's ever faced. But he decides if these two factions can't come to a satisfactory agreement, whoever loses is likely to turn to Vercingetorix, and it's going to get worse. So Caesar comes to the Aedui, and he judges between them, and he picks this guy named Convictolavis. Remember that name, Convictolavis. So on the shaky hope that this patches things up, Caesar exhorts the Aedui to put aside controversies and dissensions and focus on the present challenge of this very frightening revolt. Then he requisitions all their cavalry, several hundred, we have to imagine at least, and 10,000 infantry from them. Meet me near Avaricum. And then he returns to his army. Now Caesar decides to make for the capital city of the Arverni, Gergovia. Gergovia was a redoubtable fortress on a hill overlooking what's now the modern city of Clermont-Ferrand. It's about 80 miles due west of Lyon. If you know anything about French geography, it's on the west side of the Rhone. This is a hilly volcanic area in Auvergne. And Napoleon actually calls our anti-hero Vercingetorix of Clermont. So I think we can imagine this is Vercingetorix's hometown. This is the town that he was driven out from earlier by his enemies, and he took it back. There's a great equestrian statue of Vercingetorix in Clermont-Ferrand. He really does look like the kind of man that you'd want to die for. Worth checking out. And there's an interesting moment in the campaign here where Caesar's on the east side of the bank, the opposite side of a river. The Allier is the name of the river. And Vercingetorix is on the west bank, on the Gergovia side. He's trying to prevent Caesar from crossing. He knows where he's going. And Vercingetorix destroys all the bridges. But then Caesar tricks Vercingetorix one day. He hides 2 legions behind a hill where one of the bridges was destroyed, and then he sends the rest of the army ahead and kind of puffs it up to make it look like it's bigger than it is at that point. Vercingetorix takes the bait, kind of keeps following the army along. Caesar, meanwhile, rebuilds the bridge on the leftover bridge piles that were left, and he crosses over before Vercingetorix realizes and before he can do anything about it. So Vercingetorix wants to avoid getting forced into a pitched battle, as we've kind of discussed, and so he abandons the river entirely, and he goes to fortify Gergovia itself. So Caesar marches up to Gergovia. He finds a good spot for his camp. Actually, he ends up making 2 different camps, connects them with a long trench, a trench that was actually found by archaeologists in the reign of Napoleon III in the middle of the 19th century. But no sooner has Caesar got to work here when he gets another disturbing report from the Aedui. And he gives us the background first. Now, get a load of this. Quote, "While all this was happening at Gergovia, Convictolavis, the Aeduan, to whom, as above mentioned, the magistracy had been adjudged by Caesar," so this is the guy that he just made vergobret, as we mentioned, after all Caesar's done for him, this guy, Convictolavis, was tempted by a bribe on the part of the Arverni, that is Vercingetorix, to enter into discussions with certain young men of his own tribe, the Aedui, among whom the leaders were Litavicus and his brothers, young scions of a most distinguished house. Convictolavis shared his bribe with them and urged them to remember that they were born to freedom and to command. And here's what he tells these stylish young men. The state of the Aedui was the only bar to the absolutely certain victory of Gaul. By its influence, the rest were held in check. If it were brought over, the Romans would have no foothold in Gaul. And now I imagine the young guys were like, wait a second. Didn't Caesar just do you a huge favor by ruling in your favor in this dispute over the vergobret office? And so here's what Caesar says Convictolavis has to say about that. It was true that he himself had received some benefit at Caesar's hands, but simply in the sense that he had won an entirely just case before Caesar's judgment. And, after all, he had a greater duty to the general liberty of the Aedui and the Gauls. Why should the Aedui come to Caesar to decide a question of their own right and law? any more than the Romans should come to the Aedui. So I like it how he turns that. He's like, well, maybe Caesar judged in favor of my case, but isn't it an indignity that we even had to have Caesar come in and decide, right? Clever guy. Going on, the young men were speedily won over by the speech of the magistrate and by the bribe, of course, and avowed that they would be the very first to support his design. Then they began to seek a means of executing it, because they were not sure that the state could be induced offhand to undertake a war. And, end quote. And yes, the Aedui, they reasoned as a people, would not be so easily swayed to revolt against Caesar, who, after all, as we've mentioned in the previous episodes, kind of made them the primo tribe in Gaul. So I think this whole episode offers some really interesting lessons in how to get a large group of people to revolt who are not at all disposed to do so. Here's the plan that they come up with. Quote, "It was resolved that Litavicus," one of these brothers again, probably the oldest, "should be put in command of the 10,000 soldiers who were to be sent to Caesar for the war." As we've mentioned, Caesar requested them earlier. "And that he should be responsible for their leading, while his brothers hastened forward to Caesar himself. They also determined what the plan of action that follows needed to be. And it was as follows." Continuing, "Litavicus took over the army, and when he was about 30 miles from Gergovia, he suddenly called together the troops and with tears addressed them." Listen to this story. The names that he's about to mention, you haven't heard yet, but it'll become clear what they mean very shortly. He says, "Where, soldiers, are we headed? All our knights, all our nobility is perished. Epiretorix and Viridomarus, chief men of our state, have been accused of treachery by the Romans and put to death without a trial. This you shall learn from men who actually escaped from that same massacre. For all my own brethren and all my kindred, too, have been put to death, and grief prevents me from declaring myself what was brought to pass." So he's basically telling them, I've got horrible news. Hear it from men who just brought it to me. There's been a massacre. And so here's what happens. Continuing, quote, "Men whom Litavicus had drilled in what to say were presented, and they set forth to the host the same story in detail, that many horsemen of the Aedui had been put to death because it was alleged that they had held converse with the Arverni, that they themselves, these guys that he's produced, had hidden in the general throng of soldiers and so had escaped from the midst of the massacre." And so, this has the expected results. Continuing, quote, "The Aedui shouted with one accord and entreated Litavicus to determine the best course for their safety. 'You are speaking,' quoth he, 'as if this were a matter to be deliberated, as if it were not obvious what was necessary, namely for us to make speed to Gergovia and join ourselves to the Arverni. Or can we doubt that after committing an abominable crime, the Romans are already hastening here to slay us? Wherefore, if we have any spirit in us, let us avenge the death of those who have perished most shamefully, and let us slay these brigands.' Then he pointed to certain Roman citizens who were accompanying his force and relying on him for protection. He plundered a large quantity of corn and supplies from them, and put the Romans to death with cruel tortures. He sent messages throughout the state of the Aedui and sought to arouse them by the same falsehood concerning the massacre of horsemen and chiefs, urging them to avenge their own wrongs in the same fashion as he himself had done." End quote. Oh dear. Caesar explains that these guys, Epiretorix and Viridomarus, were indeed not dead, nor was there any massacre of the sort, and that in fact these two guys had been accompanying Litavicus and the 10,000 Aedui, but somehow they had gotten wind of his plan to trick the army into defecting, and so they rode off to Caesar, I guess the night before this whole speech that Litavicus gave, and they ride up to Caesar and they tell him, and they try to put a stop to all this. "Oh, Caesar, you got to do something." So this is the message they bring to Caesar. Caesar first finds out about the whole mess now, and here's what Epiretorix says. Quote, "Epiretorix, besought Caesar not to allow the state to fall away from the friendship of Rome through the mischievous designs of the young men. Yet this, as he foresaw, would happen if those thousands of troops joined forces with the enemy, for their kindred could not ignore their safety, nor could the state account it of slight importance. End quote. So if these 10,000 guys end up joining Vercingetorix, he's saying the rest of the Aedui will basically have no choice to go along as well. Family, patronage, power networks, etc. Can you imagine being Caesar in that moment? If the Aedui defect as a nation, it would be hard to imagine anything worse happening to Gaul or to Rome. Caesar snaps into action. He takes 4 legions with him in light armor, leaves a couple behind. At Gergovia, he takes all of his cavalry, and he explains to the soldiers the gravity of the situation, and the whole lot of them arrive at the 10,000 Aedui, which is about 25 miles away in a single day, which is pretty fast for an army. And Litovicus and his co-conspirators, they hear about this, they escape, they flee to Vercingetorix at Gergovia. Caesar produces Eporatorix and Viridomarus before the Gauls, the guys that Litovicus said were murdered. And the Aedui quickly realize what's happening, that they've been tricked, and they throw themselves on the ground and beg for mercy. Caesar spares them, and he says, "Follow me," and they immediately head back to Gergovia because Caesar has just heard from the guy that he left in charge there that Vercingetorix picked, of course, exactly that day to storm the Roman camp at Gergovia in full force. Have you ever had a day like this? Wow. But the trouble with the Aedui isn't over, because before Caesar got to the 10,000 guys, Litovicus and the Aeduan conspirators sent word around to all their friends back in the other cities of the Aedui and said, "We've joined the revolt," right? He said, they've murdered our guys. All across the lands of the Aedui now, the local townsfolk are getting whipped up by rebellious demagogues to seize the property and persons of Roman business people working in the area locally. But then they hear that the 10,000 had rejoined Caesar's side, and the leaders backpedal as quickly as possible. They send messengers to Caesar to explain, "Sorry, this was a misunderstanding. Bad men stirred up the mob. We've put them in their place. We've confiscated the property of Litovicus and his brothers and the other rebels. We've given the Romans their stuff back. You can count on us again." But Caesar says, quote, "The purpose of these measures was to obtain the release of their men," the 10,000, "but they were stained with crime, and they were tempted now by the profit to be made of plundered goods." They've seen how much they could get by, opening up the chests of these Romans, their grain storages, etc., as the business concerned a large number of persons. So, as they were alarmed by the fear of penalty, they began to entertain secret designs of war and to sound the other states out by means of deputations. End quote. And this, I think, is an interesting picture. The slope into crime or rebellion really is kind of slippery sometimes, isn't it? It may start with something small or some halting action, but once it gets going, it's really hard to stop it because people start to imagine. Going on with Caesar as he's getting these ambassadors, quote, "Caesar was fully aware of this, that they're not sincere in their apology. Nevertheless, he addressed the Aeduan deputies as gently as possible, assuring them that the ignorance and inconsequence of the common people did not make him judge more severely of the state, nor diminish any of his personal goodwill toward the Aedui. However, in contrast to what he said, he himself was anticipating a greater rising in Gaul, and that he might not be surrounded by all the states, he began to plan how he might withdraw from Gergovia and once more concentrate the whole army without allowing a departure occasioned by fear of the revolt to resemble flight." End quote. So I'm going to skip most of their Gergovia episode, which is interesting and worth reading, but we've got bigger fish to fry. And here's what happens in sum. Caesar's just told us right now in the passage we just read that he wants to leave as soon as he can because he's very exposed at Gergovia. If the Aedui revolt, he's kind of surrounded by hostile terrain for some 100 miles or so, at least, in all directions. But if he starts just marching away, Vercingetorix is going to tell the Gauls it's because Caesar is afraid, because, the Aedui revolting, which is kind of true. And it will look like Caesar's fleeing, in which case the Gauls will chase them with their large force and attack the Romans while they're retreating, making the withdrawal very dangerous, potentially disastrous. So Caesar makes a measured assault on Gergovia, including a funny scene where he dresses up a bunch of donkeys and mules like war horses, and he puts equestrian war gear on these cart drivers and donkey tamers, and then he has them all ride around looking tough on one side of the hill to make a distraction. The Gauls take the bait, and then Caesar assaults the main camp of the Gauls from the other side out in the front of the city of Gergovia. His troops get too excited. A couple of his legions charge the walls of the city themselves, even though Caesar emphasized that they had explicit instructions not to do so. Then he ends up losing 700 men, which is kind of a lot. And he fails to take the city there, of course, and that wasn't his intention anyway with that assault. But then the next 2 days, he lines up his troops outside the city. He offers battle. Vercingetorix declines. And so this is a kind of a moral victory. And, Caesar marches off, and the Gauls don't follow. So, you could say mission accomplished. I'd say it's a tactical defeat at Gergovia, but maybe a strategic victory, given that he's able to extricate himself from a dangerous situation with relatively modest losses. Now then, Caesar begins making for the Sequani, Roman allies who live near the Roman province in southwest Gaul. But once he's crossed back over the river by rebuilding another one of the bridges that Vercingetorix tore down, he's approached by some friends. Quote, "There Caesar was greeted by Epiratorix and Viridomarus of the Aedui." Remember, these are the guys who rushed to Caesar to tell him about the crisis with the 10,000 Aedui. Well, they're riding along in his camp, and they come up to him, and here's what they say. "From them Caesar learnt that Litovicus had gone with the entire cavalry to incite the Aedui to revolt." And Caesar probably means by entire cavalry here that Vercingetorix lent the rest of the Gallic cavalry to Litovicus to do this. Going on here. "The two men claimed that they themselves needed to go on ahead to firm up their nation's loyalty. Although many indications made the treachery of the Aedui obvious to Caesar, and he believed that the departure of these two served but to hasten a revolt of the state. Nevertheless, he determined not to detain them, lest he might seem to be inflicting an injury or affording some suspicion of fear." So he knows they just want to go join the revolt that's already happening. And so this next bit is poignant here. Quote, "As they departed, he set forth briefly all the favors he had done for the Aedui, their position, their humiliations at the time when he had received them, crowded into towns, deprived of fields, all their resources plundered, a tribute imposed by the Sequani and Ariovistus, hostages wrung from them with the utmost insolence, the success and the distinction to which he had brought them, with the result that they had not only returned to their ancient position of esteem, but to all appearance had surpassed the dignity and influence of all previous ages. Telling the two men to deliver this message, he dismissed them from his presence." End quote. So, we're going to go keep the Aedui from revolting, right? No. Caesar describes what they actually do next. Quote, "Noviodunum was a town of the Aedui," this is distinct from the Noviodunum that we mentioned earlier, "situated in an advantageous position by the banks of the Loire. Here Caesar had concentrated all the hostages of the Gauls, the grain, the state treasury, and a great part of his own and the army's baggage. Hither he had sent a great number of horses, purchased for this war in Italy and Spain. When Epiratorix and Viridomarus arrived at the town, they learnt about the situation with their people as a whole. Litovicus, the rebel, had been welcomed by the Aedui at Bibracte, the town with the greatest prestige among them. The magistrate, Convictolavis, after all Caesar did for him too, and a great part of the Senate had gone to join Litovicus. Deputies had been dispatched officially to Vercingetorix to secure peace and friendship. And so, these guys are looking at Noviodunum in their own territory, this plum where Caesar's stashed all the goods. Quote, "So advantageous an opportunity," the two men thought, "ought not to be passed up." So they put to the sword the Roman troops on guard at Noviodunum and the Roman traders who had gathered there, and divided the money and the horses between them. They arranged for the hostages of the other Gallic states to be conducted to the magistrate at Bibracte. As they judged that they could not hold the town, they set it on fire, that it might be of no service to the Romans. All the grain that they could handle at once they removed in boats. The rest they either burnt or dumped in the river. End quote. The revolt of the Aedui has begun. Now, I'll skip here a long description that Caesar gives of a campaign of Titus Labienus, his man. Caesar sent Labienus to go handle the revolt of the Parisii. There's a campaign where he defeats them at their capital, Lutetia, that is Paris, where their commander Camulogenus proves himself a true son of the Gallic war god Camillus by dying bravely in battle. I won't narrate all of that, but just know that, never to disappoint, Labienus at the key moment of the battle does remind his troops once again to remember their pristine virtue and fight as though Caesar himself were watching. And this works, as usual. So again, Caesar giving Labienus a lot of good airtime. And Caesar, as soon as he hears about the revolt of the Aedui, he speeds north as fast as he can to rendezvous with Labienus, and they meet near Agedincum in the territory of the Senones. This is north of the Aedui. And meanwhile, the Romans' worst fears are coming true. Quote, "When the revolt of the Aedui became known, the war increased in extent. Deputations were sent around in all directions. With all the power of influence, authority, money, they strove to stir up the states. And having got possession of the hostages whom Caesar had lodged among them, they sought by threatening the execution of these to terrify waverers." Now listen to this. "The Aedui demanded Vercingetorix to come to them and develop his plans for the war in shared consultation with them. When their request was granted, they insisted that the supreme command should be assigned to them." So that was their angle, Of course, they thought that they could take control of this whole thing. And I think the result here tells you a lot about Vercingetorix. Quote, "The matter was disputed, and a convention of all Gaul was summoned at Bibracte." And I can't prove this, but I imagine that what happened here is Vercingetorix said, "No, I suppose that's a fair request. Why don't we let all the Gauls decide?" And here's what happens. Thither assembled many persons from all quarters. The question was put to the vote of the army, and to a man, all approved Vercingetorix as commander-in-chief. End quote. That gives you a sense of the charisma, I think, and the pure kingliness of this man. Caesar is, of course, very pleased to note how things turned out for the Aedui here. Quote, "The Aedui were greatly distressed at their rejection from the leadership, complaining of the change in their fortune, and feeling the loss of Caesar's kindness toward them. But nevertheless, having undertaken the campaign, they dared not part counsel from the rest. Unwillingly, for they were young and very ambitious, Epiratorix and Viridomarus obeyed Vercingetorix." End quote. And the war expands and escalates. Vercingetorix summons 15,000 cavalry from all of Gaul. Notably, he explicitly declines to summon more infantry. He's already got 80,000, according to Caesar, or so. But he says he doesn't want more foot soldiers because his strategy is not to engage the Romans in a pitched battle, but to kick them in the stomach, as they say, deprive them of grain and pack animal fodder, wear them down. Meanwhile, more tribes are revolting. He sends detachments out all over Gaul to bring the reluctant ones along as well. And he's sending contingents, forces to go make war now on the Gauls, even living in the Roman province of Transalpine Gaul, even the Allobroges, the Helvii, the Volcae Arachamici, and others. And Caesar has arranged for the defense of Transalpine Gaul. His distant cousin Lucius Caesar is handling it, hopefully, fingers crossed. Meanwhile, quote, Caesar was aware that the enemy were superior in cavalry, and that, as all the roads were cut off, he could not expect any relief forces from the province and from Italy. No one is coming to save you. Accordingly, he sent across the Rhine into Germany, to the states with whom he had cultivated peaceful relations in previous years. Never waste an opportunity to make a friend if you can. So these include probably the Ubii, for example, the Germans. And he fetched horsemen from them, from the Germans, and infantry trained to fight along with the horsemen in that special manner that he described earlier in the work. And this is funny, though. So on the arrival, he found that the horses that they were using were unsuitable. Elsewhere, he calls the German horses, in general, small and deformed. And therefore he took the horses from the military tribunes and the rest of the Roman knights and the re-enlisted veterans and distributed them among the Germans. End quote. And the German horses must really have been unsuitable indeed for Caesar to do this drastic thing of depriving proud Romans of their noble steeds. But that's what he does. And so he's headed now for the Sequanes territory again. He's linked up with Labienus. He's trying to get close to the province proper, which is now under attack. And when he gets there, this will give him more strategic options too, like linking up with allies or reinforcements. And Vercingetorix now, and Caesar doesn't say this explicitly, but I think he intends us to understand it. Vercingetorix makes, perhaps, a key mistake. He's been saying all along, I don't want to fight it out with the Romans directly. But then, all the cavalry that he's summoned from all of Gaul, they arrive, and you wonder if he got a little too confident. Well, he addresses his troops with this message. Quote, Vercingetorix got together a great number of these contingents and established himself in 3 camps about 10 miles from the Romans. He called the cavalry commanders together to a council of war and stated that the hour of victory was come. The Romans were fleeing to the province and leaving Gaul. We've got them on the run. Not true, but in his opinion, that was enough to secure a temporary liberty, but it was too small a gain to give peace and quiet for the future. For they, the Romans, would return when they had collected a large force and would make no end of the war. Therefore the Gauls must attack them while they were encumbered with baggage on the march. Then, if the legionaries hung back to give support to their comrades, they could not keep marching. If, as he felt sure was more likely to happen, they abandoned the baggage and looked to their own safety, they would be stripped at once of necessaries and of reputation. And he explains, too, that the Romans are weak in cavalry. Compared to us, the Gauls, they won't dare to challenge us or leave their column. And so the Gallic knights love this. The Gallic knights shouted with one accord that they should be bound by a most solemn oath, that no man should be received beneath a roof, nor have access to children or to parents or to wife who had not twice ridden through the enemy's column. End quote. So they're trying to psych themselves up. We're all going to be brave. We're going to swear we're going to be brave. They take this oath. Well, they fight a battle, and it does not go well at all for the Gauls. Caesar has enough cavalry that by forming his legionnaires up in a square formation, protecting the baggage, he can send a concentrated cavalry force out to clash with the Gallic cavalry, and the legionnaires can kind of move up to support them, and then the cavalry can retreat behind the legionnaires to kind of regroup. And, to everyone's surprise, the Romans put the Gallic cavalry to flight, and they kill many of them. In fact, Caesar's bet on the Germans here proves brilliantly successful. It's kind of like he went to some neighborhood kids who got tough fighting with bicycles and baseball bats, and then he gave them motorcycles and machetes. And the Germans are just brilliant. They're decisive, in fact. And Plutarch here has an interesting comment that I'll include. He says, quote, in the main, Caesar got the best of the struggle, and after a long time and much slaughter overpowered the barbarians. But it appears that at first he met with some reverse, and the Arverni show a short sword hanging in a temple, which they say was captured from Caesar. When Caesar himself saw it at a later time, he smiled, and though his friends urged him to have it taken down, he would not permit it, considering it sacred." End quote. And so back to Caesar. After this battle, he comments, "The enemy's morale was utterly shaken because the cavalry, the part of their army on which they had placed the greatest reliance, had been routed." End quote. Vercingetorix, I think, is kicking himself here for changing his strategy and risking a direct engagement. And I'll let Napoleon tell you what he does next. Quote, "Afraid of being overrun, Vercingetorix withdrew to Alesia, a strong place in Burgundy, in the Auxois region near Montbard, a place destined to become famous. It was here that the destiny of Gaul would be decided." Alesia was a fortified hill town of the Mandubii tribe. It's about 25 miles west-northwest of modern Dijon. So it's on a hilltop, but it's surrounded on three sides by a ring of more hills. And then on one side, on the western side, there's a broad plain. Vercingetorix and the Gauls build a 6-foot-high stone wall right in front of the town walls. They trench it out. This is out in front of the fort. It's on the hillside, and they camp between that wall and the town walls proper. They're outside the town. Caesar arrives close after them. He sizes up the terrain, and he decides to build a 10-mile fortification entirely enclosing Alesia, with a small exception that we'll get to later. Vercingetorix doesn't let him get on with this easily. Early on in the construction process, Vercingetorix sends down the cavalry. There's a great, fierce battle fought in that plain that I mentioned. But Caesar, relying on his trusty Germans, who are just elated fighting with all this new Roman firepower, he manages to turn the battle in the Romans' favor, and it ends with a great slaughter of Gauls, and the rest of them retreat to the city proper. Vercingetorix now has some difficult decisions to make. Caesar explains, quote, "Vercingetorix now made up his mind to send away all his horsemen by night before the Romans could complete their entrenchments. His parting instructions were that each of them should proceed to his own state and draft everyone who was of military age for the war. He repeated to them all the services which he had performed for them and urged them to bear his survival in mind and not to deliver to the torture of the enemy one who had done sterling service for the liberty of all." I think that personal appeal is really interesting and kind of kingly, right? He showed them that if they proved indifferent, 80,000 chosen men were doomed to perish with him. He had calculated that they had grain in short rations for 30 days, but that by economy they could hold out just a little longer. After giving these instructions, he sent the horsemen silently away in the second watch of the night, at a point where a gap was left in our works. He ordered all the grain to be brought in to his headquarters. He appointed death as the penalty for any disobedience of the order. The cattle, of which a great store had been driven together by the Mandubii, he distributed man by man for safekeeping, and he arranged that the grain should be measured out sparingly and gradually. He withdrew into the town all the force which he had posted in front of it. By such measures did he prepare for the conduct of the campaign, in anticipation of aid from the rest of Gaul." End quote. So the cavalry have all ridden out to go furiously raise support from the rest of Gaul for the salvation of all of Gaul, and nobody doubts that it all depends on Alesia. Caesar spends the next few pages describing to us the elaborate fortification system that he's building. So he's constructing this 10-mile ring around Alesia, with camps periodically spaced along the perimeter. And for Vercingetorix and his guys to breach the fortifications and get to the Romans in their camps, here's what they'll have to face. First, there's a 20-foot wide trench with vertical walls. Caesar doesn't say how deep it is, but modern excavations on the site, carried out by your fellow Rome bro, Napoleon III of France in the mid-19th century, they've shown that it was between 8 and 9 feet deep. Now, once you manage to get past that, with your ladders or maybe wickerwork portable bridges, there's about 400 feet of open space within easy missile range of the wall that we'll get to in a moment. Before you get to the wall, though, there are 2 trenches 15 feet wide right in front of the wall. The one that's closer to the walls is flooded with water in most places, the other one not so. And then there's this 12-foot-high rampart wall topped with a wickerwork fence to keep out the arrows, and every 80 feet there are high towers that will be manned by your typical sling, stone, and bow and arrow troops, as well as trained soldiers operating catapults for 1-pound stones and heavy crossbow bolt launchers, the scorpions. And while those towers are raining down death on you over that 400-foot stretch, you've got what Adrian Goldsworthy describes here. Quote, "In front of the ditches were a series of obstacles and traps to which the legionnaires gave macabre nicknames. The stakes with ends that had been sharpened and fire-hardened were marker stones, kippi. Those hidden in circular pits covered in foliage were lilies, lilia, from their shape, while caltrops and spikes, half buried, were spurs, stimuli." A caltrop is a kind of a road spike thing constructed such that no matter how it falls, there's always a spike sticking up. "Such traps might cause an attacker some casualties," Goldsworthy continues, "especially if he came under cover of darkness, but their main function was to slow a charge down and rob it of momentum, as men were forced to walk past them somewhat gingerly." End quote. And Caesar has to invest as much as possible in these defenses because he doesn't have a lot of men, comparatively. The combined strength of his and Labienus' armies is maybe 35 to 40,000 men. They're going to be spread very thin along the defenses. And perhaps the most amazing thing of all is after he builds this 10-mile ring, he realizes what it means that the entire Gallic cavalry has slipped through in the night. That, he sees what's coming, and he turns around and he builds another 14-mile ring around his 10-mile ring in the exact same fashion, all those layers we just mentioned, to defend against the inevitable impending assault from the entirety of Gaul, bearing down upon the Romans. So he's preparing for his siege itself to become besieged. And here is how Caesar describes how the Gallic leaders of the rebellion at large are making these arrangements. Meanwhile, quote, "Of the Aedui and their dependents, the Segusiavi, the Ambivareti, the Aulerci Branovices, and the Blanovii, the Gauls required 35,000. An equal number from the Arverni, together with the Eleutati, Cadurci, Gabali, and Velavii, who are regularly under the sovereignty of the Arverni. From the Sequani, Senones, Bituriges, Santoni, Ruteni, and Carnutes, 12,000 each. From the Belovaci, 10,000, and as many from the Lemovices, 8,000 each from the Pictones, Turonii, Parisii, and Helvetii, 5,000 each from the Suessiones, Ambiani, Mediomatrici, Petrocorii, Nervii, Morini, and Nitobriges, those are the Belgians. A like number from the Aulerci Cenomani, 4,000 from the Atrebates, 3 each from the Veliocases, Lexovii, and Aulerci Eburovices, 2 each from the Rauraki and the Boii, 30,000 in all from the states touching the ocean, commonly called by them Armoric, among whom are the Curiosolites, Redones, Ambibarii, Caletes, Osismi, Veneti, the Veneti have been looking forward to this for a long time, Lemovices, and Venelli. End quote. This is what the big one looks like. The rough sum of what they actually ended up coming up with, by Caesar's reckoning, was 250,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. Then Caesar notes with some pain that even Commius of the Atrebates joined them. He's a man that Caesar's mentioned before. We met him in Britain. Caesar used him as an ambassador, rescued him from the Britons when he was captured. Quote, "This Commius, as we have before mentioned, had rendered faithful and efficient service to Caesar in previous years in the expedition to Britain. For these good offices Caesar had ordered his state to be exempt from taxation, had restored its rights and laws, had made the Morini tributary to him. Yet so strong was the unanimity of Gaul as a whole for the maintenance of their liberty and the recovery of their ancient renown in war that no benefits, no memory of friendship could influence them, and all devoted themselves with heart and strength to the campaign before them. When 8,000 horsemen and about 250,000 footmen had been collected, the force was reviewed and a muster was taken in the country of the Aedui. They're close. Officers were appointed, and the chief command was entrusted to Commius, the Atrebatan, Viridomarus and Epiratorix, the Aeduans, and Vercingetorix, the Arvernian, a cousin of Vercingetorix. Reinforcements are taking a while, and back in Alesia, the Gauls have a council of war. Quote, "However, when the day on which they had expected reinforcements of their own folk was past, and they had exhausted all of their grain, and knew not what was going on in the land of the Aedui, the Gauls besieged in Alesia called a council of war to consider what would be the issue of their own fortunes. Various opinions were expressed, one party voting for surrender, another for a sortie while their strength sufficed, but the speech of Critognatus should not, I think, be omitted because of its remarkable and abominable cruelty. He was of high lineage among the Arverni and considered to have great influence." And so Critognatus counsels against a sortie. He says it's risky. They've got not just their own necks to think about, but the salvation all of Gaul. And he notes, quote, "What then? Do you think that the Romans are daily engaged in those outer trenches for mere amusement? If every approach is blocked off so that you cannot receive reassuring messages from your allies, then take the Romans here to be your witnesses that their coming is imminent, and it is in fear of it that the Romans are busy in their works day and night." Now, listen to this, his proposal. "What then is my counsel? To do what our forefathers did in the war, in no wise equal to this, with the Cimbri and the Teutones. They shut themselves into the towns, and under stress of a like scarcity, sustained life on the bodies of those whose age showed them useless for war, and thereby delivered not themselves to the enemy." So, in other words, eat the elderly? I can't imagine that he means eat the children and the women, that would just be terrible for morale. But, eat the old people. I mean, wow. "And if we had not a precedent for this, I should have still judged it a most glorious thing for the sake of liberty to set such a precedent and to hand it down to posterity. For how could that war be compared to this one? The Cimbri devastated Gaul, they brought great disaster upon us, yet they departed at length from our borders and sought other countries, leaving us our rights, laws, lands, liberty. But the Romans, what else do they seek or desire than to follow where envy leads, to settle in the lands and states of men whose noble report and martial strength they have learnt, and to bind upon them a perpetual slavery? 'Tis in no other fashion they have waged wars. And if ye know not what is afoot among distant nations, look now on Gaul close at hand." He means Transalpine Gaul, the province, which has been reduced to a province with utter change of rights and laws, and crushed beneath their axes in everlasting slavery. End quote. They decide not to eat the elderly, not yet at any rate, but to send away at least all those who are unfit for battle, including, quote, "the Mandubii, whose town had received them. They were compelled to leave it with their wives and children. When they reached the Roman lines, they begged with tears and abject prayers to be received as slaves and helped with food. But Caesar posted sentries on the rampart and prevented their admission." End quote. Caesar wants to force them into starvation, to pressure them to capitulate. No one is allowed to leave. At last, though, the giant relief force of Gauls arrives at the plain before Alesia. Quote, "From the town of Alesia, it was possible to overlook the entire plain. At sight of these reinforcements, those in the fortress hastened together with mutual congratulation, and all minds were stirred to joy. So they brought out their force and halted in front of the town. They covered over the nearest trench with hurdles and filled it in with earth, and prepared for a sally and for every emergency." So an attack begins very quickly as soon as the other Gauls arrive. They have a big battle. The fighting goes on all day in the valley, where most of the army can look on from higher above. It goes on from noon to sunset. When the Gauls were confident that their own men were getting the better of the battle, and saw ours hard-pressed by numbers, with shouts and yells on every side, those who were confined by the entrenchments as well as the others who had come up to their assistance, they sought to inspirit their countrymen. As the action was proceeding in the sight of all, and no deed of honor or disgrace could escape notice, both sides were stirred to courage by desire of praise and fear of disgrace." End quote. But once again, the Romans turn back the Gauls. Caesar says the Germans are brilliant, yet again. The Gauls on the outside spend the next day making wicker bridge structures, ladders, siege hooks, and they make a night assault. And we get our first appearance of young Marcus Antonius, the great Mark Antony, manning the defenses here. But the Gauls on the outside, they get slowed down by the traps and the obstacles, and eventually the Romans fight them off, and Vercingetorix and his men inside Alesia, they try to approach and give help from the other side, but they just come a little too late to put that key double pressure on the Romans. They can't make it in time, and they give up and retire. And finally, the decisive day arrives. The Gauls on the outside have reconnoitered the fact that there is a break in the Roman fortifications, it turns out, on the northwest side, where a steep hill prevented Caesar from making any ramparts and ditches, and instead he just put a fortified camp there at the base of the hill, and he manned it with 2 legions. This is, again, the northwest end of the perimeter. And Vercingetorix's cousin, Vercingetorix, leads 60,000 picked men around in secret. And on a signal at noon, the Gauls all charge this single fort from multiple sides. Vercingetorix and his men have been watching these developments carefully. Quote, "When from the citadel of Alesia, Vercingetorix observed his countrymen, he moved out of the town, taking with him the wickerwork hurdles, poles, mantlets, grappling hooks, and all the other appliances prepared for the sally. The fighting broke out simultaneously in all places, and all expedients were attempted, with rapid concentration on that section, which was seen to be least strong," which we just mentioned. With lines so extensive, the Roman army was strung out, and at several points defense proved difficult. The shouting which arose in the rear of the fighting line did much to scare our troops, because they realized that their safety from danger depended on other men's courage. And Caesar explains with a very insightful comment here, "Generally, people's minds are more vehemently disturbed by threats they cannot directly confront." Caesar found a suitable spot from which he could see what was proceeding in each quarter. To parties distressed, he sent up supports. Both sides felt that this was the hour of all others in which it was proper to make their greatest effort. The Gauls utterly despaired of safety unless they could break through the lines. The Romans anticipated an end of all toils if they could hold their own. The hardest struggle occurred by the entrenchments on the hill, where, as we have mentioned, Vercingetorix had been sent. End quote. And so when Caesar sees what's happening there, the assault on this northwest fort, he sends Labienus